Hi everybody. So I thought I would talk today about something that tripped a switch after I got a DM on Instagram. Now I don't know who this person is. I haven't asked who it is. But they asked me just point blank, are you rich? Which I thought was a really odd question, but I can understand why somebody might ask it. And I think the first reason is that I'm 36 years old. I probably look older than that. I don't know. And I guess, I don't actually know. The truth is I don't know. But clearly there are some things that I'm putting out into the world that make me look successful, doing better than the average person, like I've got nice stuff, like I'm living a nice life. And these things are probably all true, totally. I think I do make good money. I obviously started a business 5-6 years ago now, and it's done good. It's not a unicorn, but it's definitely a business that I'm proud of and I've worked incredibly hard on, and it has given me access to things that I don't think I would otherwise have been able to sample as part of life's interesting bounty. I don't know if I'm rich, is the actual truth. I would probably say it depends. One of my favourite philosophers, Jason Bridges, he's a contextualist, and I went to see him talk about, it must have been 7 years ago or something, about the question, are you rich? And he gave this absolutely brilliant talk. This was in Zurich. I'm going to Zurich tomorrow. And yeah, it was just absolutely fascinating because that question is really just very much context dependent. And I think the truth is that, so a lot of my clients, and I'm obviously not going to give too many details here, but more than a handful of my clients at my business are extremely wealthy. We're talking billionaires, people that own huge businesses, publicly traded companies, people that have been at the very top of a bank, people that, we're talking very, very wealthy people. I am not in their stratosphere. Let's just clear that up. I don't know where in the sort of strata I exactly fall, but sort of relative to my upbringing and my parents' level of financial comfort, I'm definitely doing well, and I'm doing well for my age. So my family, and this is another contentious topic, are, I think, sort of at this point probably just middle class. But I think growing up, they would have probably said they were working class, but they wanted better for me and my brother. And I do think they basically ran a sort of social mobility experiment on me and my brother. So I had parents that both worked night shifts. My dad was a police officer, my mother was a nurse. Their parents in turn were, so my dad grew up with a single mother, and she was a circus act. and a magician, and my mother's parents were a baker and a carpenter. So quite sort of, I mean, very like classic, normal working class people doing working class things in working class jobs. I will say that, you know, my dad's family's from London, and obviously if you inherit anybody from London or nearby, and especially if they were sort of, you know, the silent generation or a late boomer, you're probably gonna like inherit fairly good assets from them, even if they were working class. And yeah, the same is true of my mother's side of the family. I think the second side of this reflection is that when I'm asked if I'm rich or, you know, doing well, I think I always have to render that question highly contextual. And I would say, yeah, within my sort of peer group, I would say I am. And I think definitely relative to my parents' income level and, you know, the jobs they had, basically, I think I've done very well for myself. But I do think there is another side to this, and I think anybody who's a millennial with kind of boomer parents, so like parents that are that, you know, I don't know exactly the age group, but my parents are in their early 60s. And as I say, they always had sort of normal person jobs. They didn't go to university. My mother went later in life as a sort of passion project. She did a maths degree at the Open University. But I would say one thing that does render the contextualist reframe slightly more challenging is that, having been a sort of social mobility experiment of my parents' making, it was as though I was in sort of two different competitions. And obviously nobody framed this necessarily as a competition at the time, but I think that was overall the structure and the way it was intended, because life is competitive, and why give your children opportunities and advantages, if you will, if you don't also think these could be competitive advantages in the end. So I think I stop myself putting myself in the rich category whenever I compare myself to people in the boomer class, even boomers like my parents, who were for much of their life just normal working class people, if you will. Probably going to get backlash for that. You're probably thinking, you don't sound working class, you must have middle class parents. They are probably middle class now, I agree. I don't know how that works. I don't know how class works, people. I'm not a political theorist. But so there's that. There's comparing yourself to your parents, and actually comparing the amount of effort, exertion, and just, I don't know what you would call it, just the things you have to do to achieve the same level of comfort as your parents achieved. It has absolutely gone wild. It's just like, so here's an example. When my parents, when I was a little girl, and we were living in Maidenhead. I was born and raised in Berkshire. We lived in a very modest, for the area and relative to my peer group, I'll get onto that in a minute, a modest house. We lived in a series of modest houses that my parents could afford. So my parents were police officer, nurse, absolutely nothing odd going on there. But I looked up those houses the other day on Rightmove, being, just a low-key internet sleuth. Love a bit of postcode gossip. And I found that these houses, which were the sort of houses someone in a totally ordinary, respectable, working class, lower middle class profession could buy, these houses are all more than £1 million now. And I think if you were to say to somebody of my age in a similar job, police officer, nurse, can you afford, with a mortgage, £1 million house? They would say no. It's completely out of the question. Most people in those kinds of jobs, even if you're a double income household, one's doing one, one's doing the other, unless you have been given a gift, you probably will struggle to get onto the property ladder, even at the bottom, in an area like, Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire. Anyway, look. So I think when you compare yourself upwards to even your own family, people who didn't have the education I've had, didn't have the opportunities I had, absolutely did the most to provide the most for their kids. These are apples and oranges. You are gaslighting yourself if you compare yourself to your parents. Compared to my peers, things get a little more interesting, or things are actually all the more obfuscated. And I think even I am now part of this obfuscation puzzle of not really knowing who's achieved what with what. And so, just for complete context, I grew up in a really nice area. I went to really nice schools. My secondary school was a grammar school in a town called Marlow in Buckinghamshire. It's a very rich, affluent area. There's no doubt about it. It's one of the priciest areas in the United Kingdom. The school is fantastic. People who went to private schools for primary school went to that school for secondary school because it was such a good school, provided a really good education. And I remember at the time, you go to school, you don't know what other people are about. You're not entirely sure. There are a few clues kicking around. People would come in with their PE kit in maybe a River Island bag. Somebody else might have an Asda bag. Somebody else might have something really out there, like the Disney store. Wow. And you had to sort of try and with people all wearing uniforms as well, the cues and the clues back in the early noughties, they were a little hard to tease out, actually. It was not always easy to know who was what. And I don't know if anyone else is like me on this one, but I think because I've got this kind of quirky personality of being a bit status anxious, if I'm completely honest, I've always wanted to know what I am. I've always wanted to know what box am I in? And I think that's partly a British thing. People are obsessed with class in this country. People are obsessed with knowing what class they are. Are they socially mobile? Is that even a real concept? And I think it was just very tricky knowing who was from a good family growing up. And I did go to a private school for the first 10 years of my life. So even then, when I had parents that were doing nights, they were working overtime to put me and my brother through a private school each. They were even doing like side hustle things to make extra money at that time. So I have basically never really known who my sort of social equivalents really are, even within what you might consider a sort of constrained given peer group. And I think that even, I'm 36 now, and obviously so are my peers from my year group at school. And while I'm not really actively in touch with anybody from school, you can see on social media like who's bought a house, where the house is, who's having kids. Let me tell you, that seems like a huge flex in a cost of living crisis. You can just sort of piece things together where it's like, okay, credit cards don't buy that. Credit cards don't buy a 2,000 square foot terrace house in Putney. I don't think credit cards do that. Definitely not. So you start to you have to read between the lines and be like, right, so I think that's maybe like because you might figure out like what the people do for a living and stuff, and you're like, oh, I wouldn't have thought you could buy that with like a junior architect salary. Wouldn't have thought you could afford that as a hairdressing receptionist. And then you start thinking, God, there's family money. There's family money. God help us all. There's family money, and these people have been given deposits, which is awesome for them. As people say, I love that for them. I don't want to take that away from them. I think if you have a family that is giving you stuff, I am friggin' happy for you. That rocks. That rocks. That was not my position. When I bought my house in Sandbanks, how many years ago? 2022. You do the math. When I bought my house in Sandbanks, I made every single pound that went into the deposit on that house. Actually, admittedly, we did have a tiny bit of help with stamp duty. My husband's grandmother had an untimely death, and we did receive a bit of help with stamp duty. I'll give you that. And the stamp duty was horrifically expensive, actually. But nevertheless, I put down this 25% deposit on this house. The deposit was like £350,000, and it was just hard work and honestly just fluke, luck, and as much bull sweat as a girl could muster. But yeah, I came up with that money. That was completely on me. But the thing is that I could compare myself to someone in my peer group from school, and I went to school with like really, it turns out, really well-off people. And I also compare myself to people in my family, like the boomers above me. Some of them very wealthy, some of them really wealthy, and obviously my own parents are now what you might consider pretty comfortable, pretty well off. Like, when you buy at the right time as a boomer, like, yeah, you benefit from so many things that have changed in society over the last 40, 50 years. And I don't want to throw any shade on that stuff. These people didn't ask to benefit to the extent that they did. And the same goes for, my old school friends who, some have been given deposits, some of them have worked their asses off. Sometimes I can't tell the difference. In some ways it doesn't really matter. But when it comes to reflecting on the question of, am I rich? It's a tricky one, because I think in a world where you can't but help compare yourself to other people and try to situate yourself in that financial matrix, which is in many ways just behind so many smokes and mirrors. It's seriously hard to tell, and in some ways it would be better for me never to even try to understand where exactly I sit. And I think, to be honest with you, that feeling of wanting to know where I sat relative to other people, it's partly a personality thing. It's definitely in there. There's an aggressive competitive streak, a status anxious, status deficient streak even, that wants like a hard truth about who I am, what box I sit in, and yeah, and I'm willing to know the truth about that. But it is difficult because I think in some ways I do myself a disservice by not necessarily giving myself enough credit for having worked for the things I've been able to achieve. But also, also not really knowing what those things are worth ultimately in a more sort of existential way. And just as a final reflection, I just want to say I always dreamed growing up, at least from a certain age, because this was effectively what we were all being indoctrinated to believe at school. That you should be on like a good 6-figure income, whatever. And I think one thing that I've learned since having money, never mind being rich, don't know if I'm rich, as I say, agnostic about that, probably am to some people, probably not to others. But I will say that having money such that you can buy what you want without having to have credit cards, without having to go into debt, you can actually very quickly exhaust your desire for materialism. And I always used to think, before I had even made, £25 doing the work I do now, I think I always used to look at celebrities, for example. I used to think of, celebrities, influencers, whoever. And I used to think, God, if I had their money, there'd be no end to me shopping. I would just be bouging my way around, Balenciaga and God knows where. Just, I would be having a gay old time. And actually, when I was, when I had just moved into the Sandbanks house and, was obviously making very good money. I mean, this was, it wasn't high 6 figures. I mean, the business is making high 6 figures every year, but it was a decent income, I'm not going to lie. But my point is that I think it's very easy to look at people making really good money, people that are doing all sorts of impressive jobs, earning, really good money, and to think that money will buy them happiness, and that being able to spend in that way will bring you any type of deep satisfaction or just a permanently high level of excitement for your own life. And I think what I realized really quickly, and this sounds like a humble brag, and I really don't mean for it to sound like that, because I grew up in a household where, my parents worked all the time for not as much money as I make, and I'm acutely aware of that. And there are people doing jobs now that don't earn anything like what I make, and it's not fair. But I will say this: being able to buy whatever you want, and I'm not going to say my desires are particularly lofty. I don't have a car. I don't drive a Lamborghini. I don't do any of these things. These are not interests of mine. But being able to buy what you want, and being able to buy what you want all the time, actually made me ill. It made me, there was a complete chaos to it that was sick making. And me and my husband will both tell you that doing well and actually losing control over the spending and sort of letting that get completely blown out of all proportion, like a freaking kid with a jar of Nutella at a breakfast buffet in Marbella. It was just, in some ways, it was just completely disgusting, morally and aesthetically. And there came a point where I personally needed an intervention. And I must have had, I don't know, maybe 30 different tarot readings on how crazy out of control and frankly unsatisfactory my life had become. And I obviously don't say that to brag, because obviously, having money is better than not having money. I'm not going to deny that. But I think I used to certainly look at celebrities and influencers and think, God, if I had that money, Jesus Christ, I would just be, I would be bombing down the highway in my, cerulean blue Lambo, and I would, commission vegan Birkin bags and God only knows what. I used to think this kind of shit. Total fantasy, not actually what I wanted. But yeah, it just makes you ill. It just makes you ill. I think the ultimate truth to the question is, the question of are you rich, is that it's obviously very rich coming from me, that in some ways I would rather go back to a simpler life with less money, fewer trappings. But I'm also acutely aware of how lucky I am to be able to take care of all my needs, all the needs of my cats, and to obviously be able to, give what I can to other causes as well. I'm not saying I'm, the philanthropist of the year, but it's nice to be able to give to the things I care about when I want to. And in some ways, that brings me the most satisfaction of all. So that's my answer to the question of are you rich? I would love to hear what you have to think on this topic. I think it's a really interesting one, and definitely something that us British people, I don't think, really talk about enough. I think we're all a bit afraid of numbers and afraid of disclosure. And I do find that a shame. I do. I think it would be nice if people were a little bit more honest. And I think it would not only reassure more of us that we're kind of fine, but also I do understand that the world is going through huge amounts of turbulence and turmoil, and the cost of living is a bit obscene at this point. I sometimes just don't know how anybody, doing jobs like police officer and nurse, I don't know how you're meant to compete in this market when you're not doing something completely extraordinary, because it just looks like it takes being extraordinary to just be as fine as your parents were, for instance. And I just find that just a bit odd, a bit sad, and I think we would all do well not to gaslight ourselves relative to our parents' generations, because things aren't like that anymore. You know, it does take some pretty crazy levels of effort to even have the same as people who were on modest salaries in the 80s and 90s. So I'll leave it with that. Obviously, we'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Cheers.